Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I am Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I am excited to talk with Malka Rappaport Hovav today about lexical semantics. Welcome to the show, Malka.
Thank you for having me.
So, Malka Rappaport Hovav holds the Henya Sharif Chair in Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is a member of the Department of Linguistics and the Center for Logic, Language, and Cognition. Her research focuses on lexical representation and its relation to conceptual structure and morphosyntactic realization. So if that doesn't really make sense, hopefully by the end of this podcast, you will know what all of that means, more or less. So I wanted to start out just asking a broad question about what is the field of lexical semantics, and in particular, what does it mean to be, to just talk about lexical semantics rather than semantics proper?
Okay, well, if we, break down lexical semantics into its components, so lexical means word, right? It refers to having to do with words, and semantics is semantics. There really shouldn't be a distinction between lexical semantics and other types of semantics. Lexical semantics is just one subfield of semantics. And if you may, lexical semantics deals with the semantic contribution of words to the semantic representation of sentences as a whole. So if we know what a sentence means, we know what it means by virtue, partly, right, of what the words in the sentence means. And I say only partly because you also need to know the structure of the sentence in order to know what the sentence means. Just having knowledge of what the words means will not give you the meaning of a sentence. And so, many people think naively that a sentence really just contains words only, but sentences contain words and structure, and different sentences with the same words but different structure can have radically different meanings. Before the development of formal semantics, there really wasn't any distinction between semantics and lexical semantics. Lexical semantics was semantics. In fact, in early work on generative grammar is the framework within which I do most of my research. So there were researchers like Jerry Katz and Paul Postel who were the first people within generative grammar to deal with semantics, and they dealt mostly with lexical semantics. But in the 1970s, what became dominant in semantics was formal semantics. And that's a field of study which grew out of the tradition of logic and philosophy and math. And the focus was mainly on logical connectives and the like and or word quantifier words like all, every, some. These have a lot of logical import. Or the semantics associated with functional categories like tense or aspect or definiteness. Now, if you take all of these things out, what's left? Well, what's left is what we somehow almost intuitively think as the semantics of words, mainly that part of the meanings of sentences which bear the main conceptual content, right? So, I can say, the dog will enter the room, the dog entered the room, the dog has entered the room. And these are all, in some sense, variations on the theme where the content of the message is in the words dog, enter, and room. And lexical semanticists typically focus mainly on the contribution of the conceptual content of, words. There are other technical ways of referring to them, but in any event, things like words that have this conceptual content, like dog, enter, or will. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, then, if we have this sentence like the dog will enter the room, the sort of like formal semanticists might be dealing with the and will, whereas the lexical semanticists would deal primarily with dog and enter and room, and then obviously one of the other things you said was structure, right? So who deals with structure, and how does that relate to lexical semantics? I know we'll get into this a little bit, but is that more of in your domain, or is that more of formal semantics, or both?
Well, I mean, structure, by structure, I mean syntax, right?
Right.
Syntax is kind of the thing that's abstract, and it's a bit hard for people who don't have a background in linguistics to sort of understand. But particularly in generative grammar, we assume that sentences are represented not only as strings of words, but strings of words that have some kind of hierarchical structure. And this hierarchical structure is, in some sense, the input to semantic representation. But I mean, just think about it. The man chased the dog means something different from the dog chased the man, right? Even though we have the same words. Now, here you might say it's just the word order which is different, but that's because in English we encode the notion of subject in terms of word order, and the notion object in terms of word order. But in other languages, that's done differently. And in any event, this is something technical, and one needs to learn a lot of linguistics in order to understand this rather deeply. But the structure of the sentence is also, the way the words combine with each other, the order in which they combine with each other is also very important. Now, I should point out that when we say that, the formal semanticists will look at words like will or the, there's clearly interaction between the conceptual content of words like dog, enter, etc., and the components that encode things like tense and aspect. And so, in many ways, the lexical semanticist has to know a lot about syntax and semantics because that's the aspect of lexical semantics which interests me most, and in fact I guess that leads my research agenda, and that is how the meanings of words interact with the more grammatical aspects of sentences.
Right. And we'll get to more of that later. So I think at this point, I'd like to just maybe try to introduce a few of these concepts. So, and you've written a lot on, these kinds of topics. One of the papers I found to be really helpful when I was just getting into the literature is a paper you wrote with Beth Levine, and I think it's called Lexicalized Meaning and the Manner-Result Complementarity. And in it, you go through some pretty foundational concepts and terms, and you define them, right? And to me, it seemed like they were also kind of driving your agenda, or always in the background of, okay, this is how I'm approaching these sorts of lexical problems. So one of the terms you define is lexicalized meaning, right? Can you illustrate what this is? What is lexicalized meaning?
Yeah. So when we hear a sentence, right, we understand many things, right? And one of the things that interests the linguist is to figure out what the contribution of the different components of the sentence are to the meaning of the whole, and how do we represent the meaning of the whole? Now, that's a technical question, but we certainly have inferences that we can draw, right? So if I say the dog will enter the room, it means that there is going to be an event which hasn't been realized yet, right? That's in the future, et cetera. So there are a lot of that's an inference, right? So there are a lot of inferences that we draw when we hear a sentence. And, the sentence doesn't wear on its sleeve, in instructions, how we derive the different inferences that we make from the sentences that we hear. And when I talk about lexicalized meaning, I mean that sometimes there are inferences which we naively might think come from the meaning of the word, but in fact, if one looks at the different appearances of a particular word in many different contexts, and assuming which is a very big assumption, right? But let's assume it's a sort of an idealization that the meaning of the word remains constant in different contexts. Then what we find is that the source of the inference can't be traced directly to the word itself, but rather to the surrounding context. So to give you an example, if I say, I cracked the egg. Now, by virtue of your knowledge of the meaning of the words, but also by virtue of what you know about the world, when I say I cracked the egg, especially if there is no context, right, then there's a certain image, right, which you conjure up. And so probably by default, you'll assume, right, that I'm doing something intentionally. And you know that I did something to make a crack in the egg. You may assume that I actually cracked the egg and then, I had the contents of the egg, except for the shell, put into a glass or some kind of container. And you may even conjure up a way in which I did that. But in fact, right, if we look at crack in many different contexts, we'll find that crack doesn't necessarily entail that there's an intentional agent. In fact, there may not be an agent. Something may develop a crack without there being an agent, right? So when I say I cracked the egg, the fact that there was an agent there, that doesn't come from the meaning of the word crack. That comes from the fact that there's a first-person pronoun there. And because it's a first-person pronoun, we know that the subject of the sentence is animate and human. And we typically attribute to humans intentional actions, right? But cracks can come about by accident, and even people can produce cracks by accident, right? So when I look for the meaning that's lexicalized in a verb, I'm interested in sort of filtering out all of those inferences that are sometimes very, very, very common, and so common that we tend to associate them with the word itself. And I'm interested in saying, well, no, let's try to get at what's really only associated with the word, right? In this particular case, the verb, because most of my work deals with verbs. And then we can start looking at what the contribution of the verb is, what kinds of inferences come from many other things.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're trying to do, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is sort of take the interpretation that we get with a sentence like I cracked the egg, and then parse it in a way that makes sense of all of the uses of all the possible uses of crack, right? So when you're looking at a single sentence like I cracked the egg, right, you're going to have all these inferences, but in order to actually tell what contribution crack is making, you have to look at all the other ways it can be used, and then go back to that one sentence and say, okay, given all the other uses, this is the actual contribution in this context. Is that
correct? That's it. That's actually correct. And sometimes, sometimes what we're mostly interested in is figuring out what inferences are not associated with the word rather than what are. And sometimes you have to go to really strange and bizarre contexts to see that a word can actually have a meaning, right? Where a very common inference doesn't necessarily have to hold.
Right. Yeah. So that's really helpful. So another, part of the title, right, is this manner result complementarity. So what is the manner result complementarity hypothesis, which you and Beth argue for, and how might this be related to what we've talked about, the lexicalized meaning?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I want to stress that it's a hypothesis, right? It may or may not be true, but it was based, right, on an observation, right? So when we started many decades ago, right? Decades ago, we started intensively studying the lexicon of English. Since then, the lexicons of many different languages have been studied very, very intensively. But we started out with English. What we found was that there were certain patterns of, which semantic components typically find themselves together in a single verb. So there are many sentences which describe a change of a certain sort. And in those sentences, we may have a description of the change and also the manner in which the change comes about. So let me give you an example. So if I describe myself making my way from one place to another, I can describe the change, and that change is the fact that I am traversing a path to a different location. So I didn't undergo a change in my internal constitution, but my location has changed, right? And in order to describe the path of traversal, I might say what direction I took. I entered the room. That means I started outside of the room, and then I ended up inside the room. I exited the room. That means I started out inside the room, and then I went out of the room. I arrived. I ascended. I descended. I went up. I went down. I approached, etc. But I also can describe how this change was brought about. So if we're talking about the locomotion of an agent, of an animate entity, right? It may be through walking or climbing or skipping or hopping or driving or skiing. And there are, in fact, many other ways, manners of locomotion. Now, what's really striking is that when we look at classes of verbs of motion, and this is strikingly the case in all languages that we've looked at, either the verb describes the direction of motion. It may describe some other things like, so enter means, not only coming towards the goal, but also the goal of the path has to have some kind of internal structure. But in any event, the main thing that the verb does is it gives you the nature of the path, and it doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything about the manner in which this was done. So if I arrived at the airport, I could have arrived by running, skipping, jumping, driving, cycling, etc. And when the verb describes the manner of motion, it typically does not describe the direction of motion, right? So running can be up a hill, down a hill, into a room, out of the room. And we don't have different verbs for running into the room, running out of the room. Interestingly enough, this same dichotomy we find in other areas of the lexicon. And so just to give another example, when we look at verbs which describe change of the state, like break or crack or melt or freeze or heat or widen or clean, right? These are all verbs which talk about an entity undergoing a change of state. Well, that change of state may have happened spontaneously, or it may have been brought about, right? So something can break, but I can break something, I can crack something, I can melt something, I can freeze something, I can widen something, and I can clean something. But if I do that, right, I can do it by any means, right? And so, and once again, here's where, you asked how does lexicalized meaning come, the notion of lexicalization come in here. So when I say I cleaned the counter, right, because of what we know about what a counter is, right, and our culture makes use of certain typical instruments for cleaning. So we have a sense of how we clean the counter. If I say I cleaned the tub, we may think of a different activity or manner which brought it about. But in fact, the verb itself, and I'm going back to what I hinted at earlier, and I could say you sometimes have to go to odd context to see what kinds of context it's able to still manage, right, to express what it wants to express. So I can say, I cleaned the tub by saying abracadabra. Now, we know that this kind of event, unfortunately, right, will probably take place, right, in Never Never Land, right? But the verb actually doesn't care, right? The verb actually doesn't care. So clean only means come to be in a state of cleanliness. And of course, you have to understand what cleanliness means. It doesn't matter. But so the verbs that describe the state which changed typically do not describe the means by which this change of state was brought about. That would be the manner, right? On the other hand, there are verbs which describe activities or manners, if you wish, which are prototypically brought about, typically engaged in order to bring about a change of state. But if the verb specifies the nature of the activity, we call this the manner, then the verb does not specify the change of state. So if I say I battered the window, right, you'll typically assume that the window broke, right? But I could say I battered the window and it didn't break, right? If I wipe the counter, you will typically infer that I wiped the counter and I made it either dry or clean, right? But it's okay to say, right, I wiped the counter, but it's as dirty as it was before, or it's as wet as it was before. Or if I say, the truck hit the window, you may assume that the window broke, because typically if a truck hits a window will break. But the verb, right, specifies the manner, but it does not specify the change of state. And there's nothing wrong with saying the truck hit the window and nothing happened to the window, right? Now, let me just explain that if I say, I widened the road, but the road didn't change in width, that is a contradiction, right? So verbs do indeed lexicalize certain things which cannot be contradicted. We say they can't be defeased, that they cannot be contradicted, but there are inferences which can be contradicted. And when we see that there are inferences which can be contradicted, we typically can assume, right, that those inferences do not come from meaning which is lexicalized in the word. Now, the fact of the matter is that linguistic reality is a lot more complicated than these examples lead us to believe. So, the hypothesis of manner result complementarity is that there's this grammatical constraint, right, which should be evident in all languages, right? And it says that we can put together meanings, but there are constraints on how we put together meanings, and we cannot lexicalize both manner and result together in the same verb with the same minimal component of the verb. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, but the minimal component of the verb.
Right. So let me just play devil's advocate a little bit here. So why not just say, like, if you take a minimal pair, like I wiped the table clean, or sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I wiped the table, or I cleaned the table, right? Why not say that wipe just means clean in a context with the table?
Well, precisely because, this may seem very, very, very obvious, right? But, sometimes in linguistics, as in any other field, stating the obvious leads us to insights. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot say, I cleaned the table, but it didn't get any cleaner, right? But you can say, I wiped the table, but it didn't get any cleaner. And we have, these are very robust. These are very robust judgments that speakers have, and this is in spite of the fact, right, that when we hear a word like wipe, right, we know that in most contexts, the wiping will lead to cleanliness, right? And nonetheless, we know that it's not a contradiction to say, I let my husband wipe the table, and wow, it's
dirtier.
Yeah.
Right. Probably commonly said, actually. Yeah, so that's really helpful. So what I'm hearing on how this relates to lexicalized meaning, right, is that the inference that you would get from I wipe the table, of it being clean, right, is just not actually part of the meaning of the word wipe. So is it fair to say that then, like, kind of our sort of ground level, like, first step into figuring out what a word means is categorizing it, or a verb in particular, like, into one of these sort of like more broader classes of, okay, if you give me a random word or a random verb in a random language, right, I have to be able to see, okay, it patterns with these other verbs, right, or these other verbs. Is that fair as a kind of like a first step into, how do I go about figuring out what it means?
Yeah, well, you have to be really careful, right? So famously, people like Sapir and Worf said, don't take the expectations that you got from your language, like, and apply them when you're studying, some completely unrelated, both aerially and genetically, language, because each language has its own internal logic, right? And they had good reason to say that, because in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, people thought that all languages look more or less like European languages, and they also thought that European languages were, because European culture was superior, right? That other languages should look like European languages. But we've sort of gotten over that prejudice. And in fact, what we do find is, despite the fact that languages differ in amazing ways from one another, right? When you study the lexicon of a particular language very, very, very deeply, and then you study the lexicon of another language very, very deeply, and then the lexicon of another language, what you find is that the same sets of verbs, more or less, right, more or less, do seem to emerge. So it's a good rule of thumb to begin that way, but you really have to be careful, because very often translation equivalents, right, do not have the same meanings. And sometimes the translation equivalents, which do not have the same meanings, are different just in ways which are grammatically relevant. I'm sorry that I don't have an example which sort of just pops out into my mind, but it's something that you have to really be careful about.
Well, I even think about, wipe and clean, right? If you're translating from another language and, you have wipe the table, you could easily think, oh, this is clean the table, right? Because, in a certain context, it could be very clear that the table is clean, right? And this is something that they do all the time. They wipe the table, it becomes clean, right? And so I could imagine, if you didn't know the language very well, right? Or if you didn't have a lot of data, you could just easily make that sort of jump, right? And then you obviously introduce all kinds of it's a mistranslation, right? At the end of the day, and then you would have certain contexts where it just wouldn't make sense, right?
That's right. So the basic methodology will be the same in all languages, right? The basic methodology will be the same, and because in all languages, right, we have the core meaning of a word, and then inferences that are derived by all sorts of modes of reasoning, and these modes of reasoning are modes of reasoning which we attribute to how we humans think, right? And so those modes of reasoning should in grosso modo be the same in across languages. Now they may be different because they may be different in certain aspects, right? Because there may be all sorts of things like the grammatical system of the sentence of the language may. I mean, for example, there are languages in which in the perfect form, you can take the perfect form of a verb like burn and say, I burnt the book, but it didn't burn. Right? And it's not because the meaning of burn is any different in that language, but rather the perfective has a modalized contribution to the sentence, which is not the case in English, right? And so these are things that one has to be really, really careful about.
Right. But it is the case for something like I am burning the book, which you can say about events that are pre-burning books, right?
That's correct. And linguists who are interested in this kind of stuff, especially the interaction between the contribution of the sort of the lexicalized meaning of a verb and the contribution of grammatical aspect to the sentence, one finds differences between languages, but one will often find that it's the same set of verbs which show these properties in language after language.
Right. So one final question on this paper. So you mentioned that the manner result complementarity hypothesis is lexicalized in roots. So can you just tell us what is a root? I think so. There are going to be many people listening to this that are familiar with roots from Hebrew, right? And they'll know, okay, roots. Hebrew has roots, right? What is it exactly? Is that something we find in other languages, and what is special about a root?
Well, you can think of a root as the basic morpheme, right? Do all your listeners know what a morpheme is?
Yeah, probably. Yes, a meaningful unit.
It's right. The smallest, in some sense, it's the smallest meaningful unit. Right. What's striking about the Semitic languages is that a single root can find itself in many different related words, where what's semantically constant, right, is very abstract and very, very difficult to pin down, right? But in a language like English, and one could speculate why this is. What are the differences between languages? But in a language like English, I could say that there are many different ways in which the verb break or the verb crack can be used. It can be used as a noun. It can be right. There is a crack in the vase. It can be used as an adjective. This is uncrackable, right? And then it can be used in many different ways as a verb. And so what we attribute to the root is what is constant in all of these appearances. And so when we speak about manner result complementarity, and we say that it applies to the root, in English, that's not all that significant. But saying that it applies to the root gets very interesting confirmation in languages where to say something like I broke the stick, right? The verb break is really a bound morpheme, but you can't use break, the minimal unit break, on its own. It has to, right, come with some other morpheme, and that other morpheme has to say what you did in order to break whatever it is that you broke. So, you can get something like hit break or drop break or whatever. And the fact that in these languages, you see that putting the manner and the result together, you need two different morphemes, is in some sense, I don't know if it's a complete confirmation of the hypothesis, because there are a lot of people who think that the hypothesis is wrong. I mean, this is a hotly contested hypothesis, but it's one of these, it's one of these hypotheses where the hot contestation, leads to deeper understanding of the stuff that we're studying.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So at this point, maybe we can talk about another work you've done, another book with Beth Levine, Argument Realization, where you go through, really, it seemed to me like a survey of sorts, especially in the beginning.
It's a survey book. It's a book that was meant to, I think it appears in a series of books called Research Surveys in Linguistics.
There you go. So
it was meant to be a survey.
So you go through all these different theories. So I think one just kind of like right off the bat question would be, okay, so we have verbs, right, which we've been talking about a lot, and then we have syntax, right, and we talked about that at the beginning. I don't think it's obvious right at the outset, right, that if you ask someone on the street, like, okay, is the order of words important for the meaning of verbs, right, or something like that? They might say maybe, yes. I mean, but they wouldn't really understand how syntax might relate to verbal meanings. So can you just tell us, like, what does syntax have to do with the meaning of a verb, and give an example?
Yeah. So I mean, this is actually it's a complicated question to answer, because one would like to give an answer that is applicable to all languages, and languages differ in many different ways. But think of a verb in the following way, right? A verb classifies different types of events. Okay, so there are lots of different types of events in the world, right? And the verb tells you what kind of event we're talking about, right? So, and the nature of the one way of understanding what type of event we're talking about is understanding how many participants there are in that event. So take a common verb like eat, okay? So if I have in front of me a piece of pizza, right, I pick it up and then I do what most normal people do with pieces of pizza, right? I put it in my mouth, I chew on it, and then all sorts of interesting things happen once I swallow, etc. Now, there is a verb, right, which we can use in order to convey, right, a report of such an event. One such word is eat. There are other verbs like that, right? There's devour, there's gobble, there's nibble, etc. But let's stay with eat, because it's sort of a vanilla, type of verb for the set of events which we can call eating events. And now, how do we use the verb in order to describe the scene that I just laid out? Well, I mean, it's so obvious to us that we don't even ask ourselves why this should be. But notice we say, Malka ate the pizza, right? We cannot say the pizza ate Malka, right? Now, why is that? One could, right? Consider yourself, some kind of deity, right? And right now, what you want to do is engineer a language, or just consider yourself an engineer, right? And you want to engineer a language. You could come up, right? You could make up a word. Let's call it yeet instead of eat, right? Which also describes some kind of animate entity ingesting what is typically something edible. And in order to describe that, one would say, the edible entity ate the eater, right? This is kind of hard for people to understand because so much goes against the grain of our understanding about how language works. But I just described a hypothetical verb of with those characteristics. And what's amazing is that English has no verbs like that. Hebrew has no verbs like that. In fact, no language that we know of has a verb of this sort. So there's something about the meaning of eat and the nature of the way the different participants participate in the event of eating, which determines, right, that the eater participant, which we call the argument, the eater participant or argument, will be expressed as the subject of the sentence, and the thing eaten will be expressed as the object of the sentence. Now, I should point out that this is a rather abstract way of describing what's going on, because how we encode subjecthood or objecthood, right, varies greatly from language to language. So in Latin, right, we'll identify the subject according to typically nominative case, and the object according to typically, right, accusative case. But in any event, it'll be the case which will, and the word order is just not interesting, right? You can sort of just put the words into a box and like that, and then roll them out and then put them in any order that you want, almost. Whereas in English, the notion of subjecthood and objecthood is determined by word order, and there are languages that do it in all sorts of other ways, like agreement or whatever. But, right, if we abstract away from those differences, right, a verb like eat will always have the eater as the subject and the thing eaten as the object. And once again, this is so deeply ingrained in our nature, it's hard for us to ask why that should be, right? But that's where the meanings of words of verbs especially, are important for determining the syntax of the clause that the verb appears in. And so also the number of noun phrases, right, the number of nouns that we find in a sense, also in some sense determined by the meaning of the verb. So, I can say time elapsed, but I won't say John elapsed time, right? Because elapse just refers to the passage. It doesn't refer to this. There's no causation element in or take a verb like give. Give has, not just a direct object, but has an indirect object, and that's because, right, in order for an event to be an event of giving, it must have three participants. Now, the case of the verb give is interesting because in English we have, but so let me just back up and say, in order for an event to be an event of giving, it has to have three participants. How do we refer to these participants? We might say the agent, the thing given, and the recipient. The agent, once again, will always be the subject. But what about the thing given and the recipient? Well, in English, we have two ways of encoding that in the syntax. We can say John gave a book to Bill, or John gave Bill a book, right? Those are two different sentence structures. And lots of languages have more than one way of mapping, right, verbs of giving onto syntax. And once again, this is where it's really exciting when you look at your language and you find verbs of giving and verbs of actually transfer of possession. It's actually more abstract than that. They often have more than one way of encoding their participants in the syntax. And then you say, wow, it's just amazing. There are lots of languages that have more than one way. And, it's rather surprising, I think, or it's enlightening to find that, languages spoken by cultures that are very, very, very different from one another share these very basic properties.
So then we have a verb like eat or give, right? And so basically what you're saying is that those verbs have, like, part of their meaning is to, I don't know, place constraints, let's say, on the kind of participants or arguments that go along with them. Is that fair? So like if the eat says subject has to have certain properties, right? And the object has to have certain properties and they're not going to be flipped in pretty much any language we know, right? Is that?
Let me just say, let me just make clear, right? What eat says is that I have two arguments. One is, say, typically an agent. The other is something which has something happen to it. The verb eat doesn't have to dictate, right, that one argument is going to be the subject and the other argument is going to be the object. That is a property of the language as a whole. In fact, it's a property of language with a capital L as a whole. Okay? So once again, here we make the distinction between what is specific to a particular verb and what is more general to the language as a whole.
Right. Okay. So we still, if we're trying to find a meaning of a verb, right, like eat, we still need to see, okay, I mean, eat is an interesting example as well, because you can also drop the object, right? You can drop the participant. I'm eating.
You can say I ate, but notice, once again, here we make use of our inferences, right? And if I ate, and it must be the case that there was something which I ate. Whereas, say, take kick, right? I can kick the wall or I can just kick. And when I kick, it's not necessarily the case that my foot came into contact with anything. So sometimes we have an object which is optional, but it's still understood because it's necessary for the meaning of the verb. Whereas sometimes the optionality, right, of the participant means that the participant doesn't necessarily have to be there,
right,
based on the meaning of the verb. And that's one of the things that when you do your lexical semantics carefully, you have to be able to make a distinction between these two ways of determining optional, the optional appearance of participants.
And so what you call these kinds of different syntactic patterns, right, are argument alternations, right? So we can say, like going back to the give example, give Bill a book or give a book to Bill. So does that tell us something about like the meaning then? Like, what is the significance when you say, okay, a verb behaves in this way? Then what, if anything, can we conclude about, the meaning? Can we conclude anything, or is it just kind of,
well,
haphazard?
Just like anything else, you got to work really hard in final conclusions. Because first of all, different languages have different generalizations which go into these things. So if I say that, language after language, verbs of transfer possession show more than very often show more than one option for the way they realize the participants in the syntax. Nonetheless, the actual rules which govern the way the participants can be realized syntactically vary in very subtle ways from language to language. So you can't really jump to any conclusion right away, right? But, when you, as time goes on, I've been in this field for a long time. So when I look at the lexicon of a language that I'm not familiar with, I have a sense of what it is that I'll be looking for right? But I can't jump to any conclusions right away, right? I can take what I know languages typically do as a guide, but languages differ in really surprising ways, despite the fact that they're also, it's sort of just like the faces of people, right? They're different in surprising ways. Just the fact that, everybody is different, and, there's so many people in the world, and they're all different, but nonetheless, at some level, they all have something in common, and, very, very basic things in common. And the same is true, with languages and the properties of corresponding verbs in different languages.
Right. Well, I even think about, kind of what we've talked about. Take a verb like give, right? And it has these three participants. And we can say that, okay, in another language, we can find another verb with three participants that has transfer of possession. But then we'd have to look at each of the, the elements of the syntax, right? So to in English means something, right? That might be subtly different. Give the book to someone might be slightly different than the closest equivalent in another language, right? And then,
yeah, well, even if you look at the Hebrew, right, the biblical Hebrew verb which corresponds to give, which most people take to be natan, right? It has very different properties from give. It has a wider range of meanings than give, right? So it can talk about transfer of possession, but it could be just a verb of putting, and it could also be a verb of causation. Where even in English, give and this is, by the way, very common in languages, that a verb like give also has a causation element. Just like, think of in English when you say that gives me a headache, right? Right. That sort of means that it causes a headache in me. So you really have to be careful, right? So you look at the translation equivalent of give in a language like Hebrew, right? It'll have certain commonalities, but you can't take everything for granted, right?
Right. So I just want to maybe ask a few wrap-up questions here now that we're on the topic of biblical Hebrew. So when you want to know, so we talked about a lot of different things, right? We've talked about lexicalized meaning, dividing verbs up into classes, let's say into manner or result or change. When you want to know the meaning of a verb, you take, a random verb in biblical Hebrew like natan. What do you do to analyze it? How do you go about, what's your first step in figuring out what it's doing?
I should say that there are real constraints in how far you can get in doing lexical semantic analysis in a language like biblical Hebrew, not only because it's no longer spoken, and in just a minute I'll say what the ramifications of that are, but also because the corpus isn't all that large, right? So, if you compare it with, say, Latin, which is also no longer spoken, right? There are no native speakers of Latin. Nonetheless, the corpus is much, 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 much larger. And so for any given verb, you'll find many, many, many more examples, right, of use. And much of biblical Hebrew is lyrical. And we know that, when people compose lyrics, they often, massage both the meaning and the syntax in ways. And so sometimes it's hard to draw conclusions on the basis of the lyrical parts. And so notice part of the methodology that I spoke about was, engaging in introspection with respect to the inferences that we can draw by the use of a word. And, you can't do that to a language which has no native speakers, right? Even if you go out into the bush, right, and you start working on a language which has only few speakers, you can still plumb the depths of the intuitions of those speakers, but you can't do that, right, You can't do that in a language which has no native speakers. And the fact that the corpus is not all that large really places very strict limitations. That being said, you basically you go about studying, or doing lexical semantic analysis in biblical Hebrew the way you would do it for any other language, within those constraints. And those constraints are, they're not negligible, right? They're not negligible. I mean, sometimes you may come across a hypothesis about what a particular word might mean, right? In order to be able to understand its syntax. And you say, well, I wish I knew what happens with this verb in such and such a context. And what can you do? If you're a native speaker, or if you have a native speaker, you can construct the context which would help you decide what it is that what you think the correct analysis is. And you can't do that with biblical Hebrew.
Right. So you basically, going back to our first example with wiping the table, we have this inference of it being clean. So if we have that sort of event in biblical Hebrew and we have no context, in which the table is wiped and the table does not become clean, the question is, how can we, or can we at all, say that this is a manner verb, right? That lexicalizes, just the wiping motion and not the cleaning, right? Is that's kind of the idea?
Yeah, I mean that's a constraint, right? That's a constraint, and you have to realize that there are some verbs that are very, very common, right? And there are a lot of uses, right? But then there are verbs that only have very few appearances. Right. So I mean, I did some work on verbs of manner of motion, and there are verbs of manner of motion in biblical Hebrew, but some of them are used, very, very scarcely. Mecharker, mefazez. How many times do you have this? Not very often, and especially since we have modern Hebrew now. Right, speakers of modern Hebrew sometimes, see modern Hebrew in biblical Hebrew, and that's probably not the right way. Right.
Of course, we would also have the temptation to see English in biblical Hebrew, right? Just because. Or whatever native speaker.
Well, I mean, when I look at biblical, I very often look at translations like the King James version, etc. And those are often helpful, often very, very helpful. And I think for good reason, because they come from traditions of translation. And when you're part of a tradition, I mean, the tradition may be wrong, right? But these traditions come from kind of transmission, which ultimately goes back to a time when the translators were perhaps native speakers of Hebrew or worked with native speakers of Hebrew. And so these translations are often very helpful.
Right. And that's obviously, the Septuagint, the Greek translation is obviously huge there. I mean, we have a much bigger Greek corpus than we do Hebrew, so that could be a way into some of these problems. So just as a final question, just fun, to give people a little idea of, what a lexical semanticist does. So what kind of problems are you working on today in your field that's just interests you?
Well, actually, I'm working on a problem in biblical Hebrew, and that is, this what's called the hey locale, which is actually turning out to be extremely interesting and extremely challenging. But more generally, I've devoted a lot of research to verbs which participate in another kind of argument alternation, which we call the causative alternation. So, the vase broke, I broke the vase. Or take, the workers widened the road and the road widened, or I narrowed the skirt, right? And so for many, 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 many years, people thought that these verbs always describe changes of state, and so they're eventive. They always describe something which actually happens. There's some change in time. And then it turned out that many of these verbs have other meanings where they don't really describe a dynamic change in time. They do describe a change, but perhaps along some other axis. And the most obvious, there are lots of other axes, but the most obvious is, say, a spatial axis. So you could talk about the river narrowing, further south, or your skirt narrowing at the bottom, right? The crack widening towards the ceiling. And many verbs that participate in the causative alternation show this kind of, it's a kind of polysemy, right? It's a kind of polysemy. What linguists like to do is to say, no, it's not polysemous. Right? We don't have lots of different meanings. We have one more abstract meaning from which the, eventive and the non-eventive meanings are derived. And then I discovered, and this was really a discovery of mine because I don't think anybody's ever discussed this, that there are verbs that participate in the causative alternation that do not show this this ambiguity or this polysemy. And these are verbs that are like, that describe states like cover. So, you can't say the cloth covers the couch towards the end, meaning it covers more of the couch on the left end, right? And that, on the face of it, is rather surprising given the analyses that people have had. And so, what does the lexical semanticist do? What are the verbs that work like narrow and widen? What are the verbs that work like cover? Let's map it out. Let's try to see semantically what they have in common, and then try to come up with an explanation. And that's the puzzle that I'm working on now.
Well, I'll be looking forward to reading about it when you solve it. So
I actually have a paper which I can send to you.
Great.
Which offers something of a solution.
Great. In all my spare time, I'll read it. So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you, Malka, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.